Luke Clements. I'm the Hillsborough Professor of Law and Social Justice at the School of Law at the University of Leeds. This talk summarises research that my colleague Dr. Anna Aiello and myself have undertaken, funded by the disabled children's charity Hillsborough, which concerns English children's services policies that have the effect in practice of what we call institutionalising parent-carer blame. And in this talk, I will explain what we mean by that concept. Before I dive into this talk, I'd very much like to thank Donna Kelso and Voice for Change in Staffordshire for the invitation. Donna's been an integral part of our research programme, our current research programme. She's been inspirational, but she's also provided an enormous amount of expertise. And I'd really like to put that on record because she is one of the individuals that we have relied on heavily. We've liaised with very many parent-carer support groups, but Donna has been exceptional, and thank you, Donna, both for your help but also arranging this event today. A copy of the research report by Anna and myself you can see on the slide now, and that is available online from the Hillsborough website. The research charity Hillsborough has an advice line that many parents with disabled children contact concerning difficulties they have in encountering local authorities and accessing their legal entitlements. Hillsborough gives excellent advice, but it also records the prevalence of these contacts. And where it emerges that there is a commonly occurring problem, they then refer it to the research unit at Leeds to see if we can identify whether this is indeed a prevalent concern throughout England, Wales, or Scotland. And if it is, what the causes are, and whether we can identify some sort of systemic way of addressing this rather than each family having to make their own complaints and go through the same procedures. One of these commonly occurring problems that cropped up a great deal in the last 5 years is that families who contact their children's services departments, and I should say this isn't just in England, but our research is just of English children's services authorities. But families that contacted their local authorities seeking support and assistance were distressed by the response. They felt that they were being treated as if they were neglectful or abusive or inadequate parents. And instead of providing the support that the law says is available and should be provided where it's necessary, they were sent on parenting classes as if it was their fault that they were encountering these problems, that somehow it was locating the problem within the family rather than in wider society. And the way the assessments were undertaken were intrusive and distressing. Parents would have social workers visit, insist on seeing the child's bedroom, insist on seeing the child alone, even though that child had never met this stranger. They would then sometimes make unannounced visits, or visits of very short notice, or many repeated visits, which all in total left the families distraught, and often saying that they really never wanted to have anything to do with social services again. The agency that exists basically to provide these supports that Parliament has legislated to say these supports are available for disabled children. So the group of people we're talking about, the group of people we're researching, are parents for whom the Children's Services Authority has just no cogent evidence at all that there's neglect or abuse. The only evidence they have is that this is a family with a disabled child and that they have approached the local authority for support. It might be respite care support, direct payments, personal assistance, travel, or adaptations to the home. So why is this happening? Why do local authorities direct parents to a safeguarding team when there is no safeguarding issue? The issue is that they need care and support, or the child needs care and support. It's stigmatizing to be referred to a safeguarding team. Just the very name has a chilling effect on families and can often put them off going into sort of in further detail with their requests. Why do local authorities insist that the disabled child be interviewed alone? As I've said, it can be very distressing for a child to be told that they've got to be interviewed by a stranger they've never met, particularly children with complex impairments that might not like change, not like strangers. And then the parent has to leave the room and somehow sort of hang around at the back of the house whilst their child is being interrogated. Why do social workers insist on seeing the child's bedroom when there's no evidence of neglect or abuse or anything sinister or whatever a bedroom is inspected for? Why are there these frequent visits and sometimes unannounced visits when it might be a simple request for a specific service? And why are parenting advice classes being given, or this thing called early help, which is largely a short-term intervention designed to prevent parenting or address a parenting problem, when it's quite clear that parenting is not the issue? It's impairment and disability and the barriers that families experience because they have a disabled child. And so we looked at this through the lens of the law, really. There's quite a lot of research accounts of these intrusive behaviours, this sort of form of surveillance, but we looked at it through the lens of the law and asked the question, can this be justified in terms of domestic law and also human rights law and discrimination law? And as I've said, there is quite a lot of research saying that this is happening and asking really from a social policy point of view how this can be justified. How can these sort of inquisitions happen when there is absolutely no evidence of neglect or abuse? How can they be squared with fundamental rights to protect your private and family life and your home? In order to research whether this was a commonly occurring problem, and if so, what we could do to address it, we adopted a methodology. We first of all looked at all of the English assessment protocols that we could identify, and that there are 152 potentially, and we found 143 of those. And we undertook a survey of English parent carer support organisations, advice organisations, campaigning organisations. And to that survey we had 92 substantive responses. Now, the key findings of the research, which have been widely disseminated and acknowledged, were that indeed there was a problem, that the default position for local and national, English national guidance was to assume parental failings when an assessment took place. It was a problem that I've already said, located the problem of a child's impairment within the family, very much within the parents' parenting abilities, rather than, as the social model would tell us, in wider society. And that was so prevalent that we gave it the title of institutionalising parent care of blame. And I should say that I'm not suggesting, and Anna's not suggesting in our research, that this is deliberate. We think that in many respects it's an unforeseen consequence of many, many years of particular heavy focus on children who are abused or who are indeed dying because of parental neglect. None of those that I know of were in fact disabled children, and there it's quite a different class of concern. And we located the cause of this, the current cause of this, to be in Department for Education guidance issued the most recent iteration of that was 2018. And in our view, because it really only talked about assessment in the context of children being neglected or abused, didn't have a separate route for assessing disabled children, we considered that that was arguably unlawful, and I'll explain how we came to that conclusion. As I said, the problem with working together is not only that it doesn't explain that a different assessment process should be used for disabled children, it doesn't also require that the assessors have expertise in impairment-specific issues. That's explicit within the adult legislation that any assessment undertaken must be by somebody who has an understanding of the specific impairment, or if they don't, then that they seek advice and support in that relation. But quite astonishingly, that's not a requirement for anybody assessing a disabled child. Of the 143 local authority protocols that we identified, none contained a clear explanation that a different approach should be taken when you're assessing a disabled child for whom there was no cogent evidence of neglect or abuse. 80% required that the assessor, the person doing the assessment, had visited the child's bedroom. 87% required clarification as to whether the child was seen alone, regardless of whether there was any evidence of neglect or abuse. And none gave assessors guidance concerning how you balance the decision of whether you want to investigate the bedroom or whether you want to speak to the child alone against the rights of families to have intimate spaces like that, and family life in relation to their child respected. And it's a satellite problem, but it's very concerning. Only 3% of them mentioned that in these assessments there must be legally an offer to the family to undertake an assessment of the parent carer's needs for support. And of the survey that we undertook of parent carer-led organisations, 86% considered that the assessment process was extremely unsatisfactory and intrusive. And they highlighted factors such as the lack of training and understanding of assessors concerning impairment-specific issues, the intimidating nature of the assessment process, the power imbalance between the local authority with all its child protection powers and the individual, and the focus on parental fitness rather than the additional support needs that families need because of their child's impairment. They highlighted what we had expected from the contacts that families had had with Cerebra, that they considered that the assessments were intrusive, often took place at little or no notice, and were often, the family was put in impossible situations. Do they say to the social worker that's knocking on the door unannounced, "I'm sorry you can't come, I've got some visitors here"? Do they say to the social worker, "No, I don't want you to see the child's bedroom. Why do you want to do that?" Because these are all pretend choices. If you say no, then of course that goes down on records, and that's evidence that you have something to hide. These are impossible situations. So really what we came up with was very obvious in one respect, that there really wasn't a disabled children's assessment route. Now, law there should be, because children in need in law is defined as two groups of people. One, children who there is cogent evidence that they're suspected of neglect or abuse, and the other route is all disabled children are considered children in need. So for a disabled child, you would expect the assessment process to be done by an expert from a team with expertise in disability issues. And they will be looking at a longer term program, because of course disability is not a short term issue. For many people who are disabled, it's a lifelong issue from cradle to grave, so that they will be looking to be there for the longer term. There would be an assessment of what the child and the family needed in terms of sort of compensating them for the difficulties they experience in terms of respite care, as I say, activities in the community, travel, adaptations and such like. And each year that plan would be reviewed, and if it was considered that it wasn't working, then increasing the support would be effectively necessary. And then once the child gets to 18, there would be a transition into adulthood in terms of handing the baton from children's services to adult services. Of course, for children who are suspected of being neglected or abused, there's a completely different process. But the problem was that disabled children and their families were being assessed during that route. That's the one you see on your left. That's the child in need route, i.e. the child suspected of being neglected or abused route. And that's dealt with by an early help team, somebody who's designed to go in quickly, work out what the situation is, if possible put in some short-term help to address the problems, i.e. If the child is being neglected or abused, we're going to locate that problem with the family, with the parents, and sort that out. So they would have a time-limited action plan to correct poor parenting, send parents on parenting class and so on. And if that doesn't work, then you would consider safeguarding, you would consider upping the ante. And if that didn't work, then the local authority would consider using its statutory powers for the child to become a looked after child and or care proceedings. But children who were not suspected of being neglected or abused, whose simple need arose out of impairment, were being pushed down that route. There wasn't, as far as we were concerned, a separate disability assessment process. Disabled children's teams did exist. They only considered 2.5% of all disabled children, and the vast majority of the children they considered were also considered to be at risk of neglect or abuse. So they were disabled children for whom there was evidence of neglect or abuse. The large group of disabled children for whom there was no such evidence were just simply being assessed as children in need because of parental failings. Now, you can't really square that sort of one-size-fits-all tick list process to assessments with obligations under British common law, but also the Human Rights Act, which is of course a British act, because that enshrined the right to private and family life and respect for the home. Article 8 contains that provision. It says yes, states can interfere with that right if there is cogent evidence. But simply saying, oh, well, the family agreed that we should come in, we should see these things, it just isn't an excuse, because the family, that's not a choice, it's a pretend choice, because they don't really have any choice at that stage, because if they refused, it would be recorded against them. And sometimes social services say, well, you know, disabled children are more likely to be neglected or abused. And of course, there is research that shows that that is true. But the research doesn't show that it's more likely that the parents will neglect or abuse their child. It shows that disabled children are more likely to be abused because of hostile environments, bullying at school, in day centres and other places like that being abused. The evidence doesn't show that they are more likely to be abused or neglected by their parents. And even if there was that evidence, that's stereotyping, and you can't do that. You've got to look at individual cases. And as you'll see on the website, I've written a note about the legal problems with stereotyping of that kind on my website. Not only does behaviour of this kind interfere with fundamental rights to respect for private family life and home, it's also discriminatory, and contrary to Article 14 of the European Convention and the Human Rights Act, because treating people who are different in the same way is as bad as treating people who are effectively the same differently for a non-specific reason such as race or sex. That's been held in many European cases, but also in a number of domestic law cases as well, as we highlight in our report. And treating disabled children simply as children that are at risk of neglect or abuse and focusing on the safeguarding aspect means that local authorities overlook, and this is consistent message that we've come from our research and from the Cerebra helpline, they overlook the fact that there are specific laws that say disabled children and their families have a right to support because of the nature of their child's impairment. And those rights are under the Children Act 1989 predominantly, but also very specifically under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act. And our more recent research has showed that there's very little, if any, training given to social workers about the statutory rights to support of families with disabled children. Those then were our findings, and as I've said, these were probably unintended consequences of 2 or 3 decades of children's guidance focusing almost exclusively on avoiding deaths of children neglected or abused, forgetting completely that there was another class of children in need, namely disabled children. And the findings, I don't think, come as a surprise to policy leads at central government or local government level. We quote in our report a number of key players who have said much the same. The chief social worker for children and families in England has said, as you can see from that slide, that even where the sole reason for contact with children's social care was because of a child's care needs, an autistic child's care needs, there was a tendency to use social work assessments as an opportunity to judge parental capacity, and that had been a long-standing complaint. In the McAllister review, one of the interim papers, he said that a consistent theme of his review was that families with disabled children felt that they were navigating a system set up for child protection, not support. In the SEND review, much the same was said, and that the consequence of that was that many parents of disabled children were put off seeking support from social care because they felt that they would be blamed for these difficulties. And in the final report from the McAllister review, it highlighted that it was particularly important for assessments to be flexible and tailored for families with disabled children, and that the review had heard time and time again from both social workers and families that the one-size-fits-all assessments process is overly intrusive and it's not tailored or well aligned with their needs. And I'm pleased to say that the current minister, has been equally positive. She was kind enough to write to my constituency MP, and in that letter she said that she was grateful for the research that we had undertaken and for sharing our concerns on this issue, namely that parents of disabled children, when they approach their local children's services departments for support, can be treated in the same way as parents suspected of neglecting or abusing their children. That the government was in fact doing all it could to improve the support for disabled children and families, and that it was to launch a consultation process on amending working together to include a stronger focus on the support of disabled children. So one can be hopeful, but I don't think we can be at all certain that this is going to end well unless we continue with our with the pressure that we're trying to do because of the research data. We can persevere and bring this to a positive conclusion. Now, that consultation the minister has just she referred to in her letter has just been issued, I'm speaking now on the 22nd of June 2023. And if you go to that website, you can see that it has been launched. And I've only just recently seen this, and I will be posting very shortly on my website, and I'm sure Cerebra will also be posting this, my thoughts on what can be usefully said in that, in response to the consultation questionnaire, to stress the need that working together, the national guidance requires local councils to have a completely separate assessment route for disabled children, looking at their needs, not their risks, effectively, looking at the sort of needs that an adult assessment of a disabled person would look at, rather than at the moment the assessment process being almost exclusively about the parent's ability and the risks that the child faces. Of course, even if working together is amended, as we hope it will, and even if local authorities then do adopt meaningful policies on how to assess, and we are currently working on research with parent carer groups, local parent carer groups, on what that guidance should look like. And as I've said, it would be guidance that focused particularly on needs rather than risks. Even if that all comes about, it will be several years before that is really embedded within the practice and the sort of culture of frontline assessors. So in the meantime, there are some quick wins. There are some quick things that local authorities can do. And we would urge local authorities, first of all, and many parent carer groups have said this, is why can't the assessor simply be kind, accessible, and why can't they listen? Why are they so acutely anxious? About risk? Why is this message being sent out to all members of local authorities when the vast majority of disabled children just need support? Why can't the local authority on its website, but also its contact information, be welcoming and supportive, not using the word safeguarding, but referring to the fact that they have powers and duties under the legislation to provide support, to compensate families for the difficulties that they encounter because of a child's impairment. There's nothing to stop local authorities developing a separate assessment route for disabled children, calling it a different name, certainly not a safeguarding route name, and having different assessment forms. And these forms, as I say, will focus on need, support, rather than failings. And one of the organisations we're working with, the Parent and Carer Alliance, is in the process of developing a new form, and also suggesting how this could be computerised, so that assessors do turn up with a different form rather than the one-size-fits-all form for child neglect and abuse. And nobody looking at local authority websites could possibly come to the conclusion that they provide accessible information, a one-stop shop of accessible information about accessing the support needs for a disabled child and their families. They're all impenetrable, often out of date, all have built-in barriers, in my humble opinion. Managing need, effectively managing resources, rather than perhaps what might be cheaper, is being more open and welcoming. National action, as I've already said, in the short term, we are seeing a slight change in the new National Autism Strategy that is requiring assessors to have experience in autism awareness and learning disability expertise. But there's nothing wider than that, because maybe 40% of disabled children are on the autistic spectrum, but that leaves 60% with many other impairments. The adult legislation requires assessors to have a much wider range of skills or access to experts with those skills. In the medium term, of course, we need to have working together amended and specific guidance issued by the government, I think, as well as local authorities on the assessment process for disabled children and their families. As I say, our current research is looking at what is fit for purpose guidance, and we're hoping that that will be published in July of this year. The guidance has been widely circulated to parent carer groups that we're working with, and as I say, we're just at the sort of proofreading and graphic designing stage for that piece of research. So very many thanks again to Donna for arranging this event, and to you all for listening, and hopefully what I've said will be of some value. Thank you.